Lucia somehow shift from the work of a practicing architect that somehow in a conventional way worked in the design and building of concrete spaces somehow, to move to a more broad idea of experience design that somehow engaged with the somehow some kind of takes onto the digital realm. During over these years, she worked with the New Museum in New York for the production of an app related to the possibility of producing an exhibition design through smartphones in a way. And then she also worked with some other corporations for the design of Metaverse, completely virtual domains, which are parallel to the physical space they live in all the time. And we also feature a work of her in one of these displayers over there, which is related to her interest into the way domesticity somehow gets influenced from the introduction of the digital realm in the house, somehow also engaging in some political reflections that are very interesting. Well, she's won fellowships. She's been exhibited in the Venice Biennale. So she's a very rich and powerful character, and we're very happy to have her here today. So without much further ado, thank you, Lucia, for coming, and please.
Thank you, Pascal, for the.
Sorry, yeah,
yes.
I think we lost your presentation because there was an update. No? So
yes, okay, let's fix that.
You know how? Yeah. Put your presentation on.
Yes. So thank you very much for coming here today. My name is Lucia Tahan. I'm so delighted to be part of this exhibition that I think looks at the history of architecture as a means of displaying and conveying meaning, semiotics, symbolism, many things that I've been very interested in throughout my career, and that, well, I'm going to take you today through my work and the things I've been doing in the past years and how my thoughts have evolved and where I am today. So my professional specialty is augmented reality. Just as an introduction, and forgive me if you already know, augmented reality is the overlaying of virtual objects on top of a camera feed. So that happens today in smartphones. In the future, that will happen on headsets in a world in which augmented reality and virtual reality, which today we only see on headsets, will merge. We have a very developed set of AR tools related to face recognition, which has evolved faster than space recognition in the sense of room recognition. Some of the reasons for that are because smartphones have developed sensors to scan faces to understand the three-dimensional meshes of faces, and also because faces are something that computers have learned to understand and to detect better than spaces, which are richer and more diverse in our built environment. One thing I do in my spare time is effects, Instagram effects. So those are some that I've done. The one you see on the left went very viral. People did a lot of memes with that like a year ago. And I'm interested in seeing where the boundaries are with the things that we can do with the technology today, which is pretty limited in a certain way, but very quickly evolving. So I try to do things like tools for drawing in space and so on, or things that change the geometry of the planes that we see around us, things that like that circle, that sphere, that can be confused with objects that are in the real world. And one of the things I really believe in today, and I haven't thought this for a long time, this is a pretty new thought, but I'd love to debate this later with you. I think that in the physical world, when we design as architects for physical spaces, we have geometry and we have tectonics, right? So in a building that we're designing as architects that is going to be built with cement and with concrete, we have the geometry of the building, and that is going to tell us how things like gravity are going to act, how loads are going to be distributed. We need to have a separation between the exterior air and the interior air and so on. And that's how the design of physical space works. Now, when we are designing for augmented reality or for virtual reality in general for virtual space, and I've just called it metaverse here because this word has been introduced recently as the dominant idea for a computing platform that will be virtual. We remove the physics from the equation. There's no gravity in virtual space. There's no air. There are no climatic conditions. There's really no need to have things upright and not the other way around, or to have windows, or to have passageways, or to have walls. There's no reason why you can't go through a wall. But in my work, and I say my work as people who are like me working in defining today the rules of the metaverse, defining the rules of augmented reality, laying the foundations for all that work, we are drawing this line. Like our work is precisely to take like a surgical knife and separate those two things so that we pick things from physics and we pick things from geometry. So for example, there are no shadows in virtual space, but then we choose to introduce shadows in many augmented reality applications so that people understand and perceive that the objects are where they are in the room. Without the shadow, you kind of don't know if the thing is elevated from the ground or not. But then we may choose to ignore physics when we let people teleport from one place to another just by clicking a button. Or we may choose that physics are not so important when lighting objects. We can light them artificially from a different source of light than in the physical world, and so on. And that separation, I think, is one of the main things that are happening today, and that I'd like more architects working on this, because architects know both realms, and people who come from computer graphics, for example, don't necessarily know much about tectonics. So I currently work in my own studio, and I'll present some of the work I do, but I also work at a big tech company in which I am the lead designer for SparkAir Studio, which is a software for creating augmented reality today. And I feel a great sense of responsibility in developing the tools that people use to create AR and having a voice in the definition of what we make possible. And the reason why I think that this is so important is because I very much agree with Lev Manovich when he says that architects and artists can consider virtual things and virtual spaces as something that needs a poetics, needs a politics, needs things that come from the realm of humanities, from theory, from history, that sometimes computer science can lack. But space doesn't lack that. Space needs that. And it's difficult to introduce because, well, what are the politics of virtual space? We don't know yet. But what if we make a mistake and then we introduce the wrong politics or our own biases in virtual space? This is the first building I built. And as Fosco was saying, I started out as a brick and mortar architect. That was in 2017. At the same time, I was doing things like writing about things that started to interest me in how media could shape the physical world. So this is an essay I wrote about the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961. And Eichmann, who was this little guy, he was a very important Nazi. And this trial was very, very important because it was broadcast, and the talks of the witnesses were broadcast to the entire world. And so there was a need to broadcast this through television sets for the first time with low resolution, low definition. This is also the trial that Hannah Arendt attended and was a journalist at. And she based her book, The Banality of Evil, and her theories on precisely Adolf Eichmann, this guy. So as you can see, Adolf Eichmann was put in a box. And this was supposed to be to protect him from bullets. But essentially, it was a way of framing a guy that wouldn't be recognizable through a TV set, so that people would know where he was in the room. He was a very banal person, but in a way, putting a box around him allowed people seeing him through media realize who he was. It gave him an identity. So this box primarily exists as a manifestation of a need from media, and not so much as a need from the physical space. So media is not being neutral, even at the very beginning of television broadcasting in the 1960s. Now, what we see with the metaverse, with virtual objects and virtual reality today has very much to do with this. Whatever we're going to be doing in augmented reality is going to affect the world and changing just immediately. It's not going to be in 20 years. I was also interested in politics, and that this work that was very much influenced by some of the graphics I was seeing coming from Sock Studio and from Fosco and Maria Bruna, in which I looked at actors in the city. This was in the context of the possible decolonization of the West Bank and the material problem of how to reincorporate Israeli settlers back into Israeli territory. It was called Return to Zion. And so I was interested in things like how cultural artifacts can translate into space. What if we start projects not from formal definitions, but from cultural ideas and concepts that permeate these spaces and that can make the city grow with systems without anybody actually designing them. This work took me 4 years. And then this is a work I did in Rome together with Fosco and Maria Bruna for an exhibition about the Estate Romana, which was a program for bringing cultural life to the streets of Rome. And here I was starting to be interested in the abstraction of space. So this was a garden, and I chose to dematerialize it in this way. So this represents kind of layers of earth. And then my architecture, quote unquote, was at the top. And what I was interested in was people coming to this exhibition and not knowing how this thing could stand, and also to create a three-dimensional object from two-dimensional elements. So these bronze threads are pulling together pieces of paper, and that allows it to stand, even though the pieces themselves wouldn't stand on their own. It was a nightmare to build as well. And we had to put a glass because it just broke all the time. This is work I did in New York, in which now I was trying to design a tool for museums to curate and create exhibitions online. So this is a place where you can take a database of, for example, paintings from an artist or from a museum collection, and they turn into 3D with just one click. So the relationships between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions and how they combine with each other and live with each other, and the relationships between what's real and what's not are always a part of my work. Also in the pavilion for Slovenia, the Venice Biennale of 2018, which I did together with Vika Rebic and many other people who participated in this, was very much about making the invisible visible, talking about water, but making it interactive as well, so that these columns acted as interfaces. You could touch each of them, and then that would create an effect in the fountain that was in the center. I also finished another house in 2018, which had a pool in the living room. So a rather strange house, but it was a place for socialization. The the person who wanted this house built wanted her friends to come over in her village, and she would imagine that they would all sit here and that this would be a place where everybody would want to come to just chat in the hot water, and that this was like a sort of conceived as a public space, but indoors. And my latest project has been a photography project of some objects that my mother created around my house, and that make me believe that people's relationship with domesticity is very much constructed around the idea of building your own space with the tools that you have around yourself. So in some of the accumulations that she just put together haphazardly, I see a lot of architecture, to be honest. These are some reinforced teeth that she had reinforced with a mesh, as if it were concrete. But I'm here to actually talk about this project, Cloud Housing, which was a project that enabled me to materialize an aspiration that I had and that I expressed many times, in which I wanted my career in technology and my career in architecture to sort of blend together. And I started seeing the opportunity in augmented reality in doing that. And through this fellowship, the Housing the Human Fellowship, I was able to develop these ideas. So Housing the Human was, Cloud Housing was an exhibition, an installation that developed in several prototypes, but at the end, it was this installation you're seeing here in which people would come and through an app on an iPad, they could see things that were not there in augmented reality. And with this, and the help of some experts, here's Daniel Perlin, and there were also professors from different schools around the world, we would explain and try to debate with the people who are coming into the room some of the aspects that I believe are going to be coming from AR and influencing the way we live and the way we experience domesticity. And these are three things and correspond to three moments in the app. So the first one is spatial data. Now, spatial data is related to the way devices sense space and reconstruct it and understand it. SLAM means simultaneous localization and mapping, and it means that as you're moving through a scene, there are points that are being taken, and then that is reconstructed into a mesh with depth information. What that enables us to do is the concept of semantics. So once we have that depth, how do we understand what is furniture versus what is architecture? How do we differentiate between different parts of those meshes? That's a very complicated question because computers don't know. And also, it's going to take them a long time until they know. And if we try to make them know, then we need to expose them to databases, probably of virtual objects that do not actually represent the entire world. Because if I encode into a computer or into a computer vision system that chairs have a certain size and a certain shape and so on, that may not be true in Tokyo, as it is true in Lausanne. And so in a way, the question of semantics is, I think, a very central one that I'm spending time thinking about these days a lot. The first prototype of cloud housing was this room in which I brought those points of depth into a material space. So I materialized those points, and then people had to do the reverse thing. I gave them an app where they would try to draw an actual room inside this space, which was very difficult. But still, people were producing images that were very coarse, but they had a very good understanding of what they were doing. Like, they could imagine it very well. And this was also to sort of bring to light what a computer sees versus what we see and we understand. There's nothing there. So everything that's there, a computer understands. but then a human understands so much more. For a human, this is a representation of an actual room. And so in the final installation, I created a living environment, let's say, if anybody's living room has ever looked like this, but that's what it represents. And then I had the 3D model of what that was supposed to look like. And both were the same, as you can see. And so as people were exploring this room, they could shift between the spatial data and the interface. Now, an actual app is never going to give you access to that spatial data. No, I mean, it could, but there's kind of no point. So some of the questions that for me were very important to ask in this part of the exhibition were, how private is that spatial data? Is the capture of your socks drawer just as private as the capture of your living room? Or what about your bathroom? What about if there's a person in the scene when you're capturing it? And how would we encode all that? And how would we protect it? The second moment is spatial interfaces. Spatial interfaces means that today we're looking at interfaces in rectangles within rectangles. So like a phone has rectangles inside that have more little rectangles inside. And that's what more or less what interfaces are today. When you extrapolate that to a 3D world, you have something much richer and very much undefined today. Some of the interfaces that we're starting to see as concepts for AR are very much like rectangles in the world. But I'm interested in things like, how are those layers of information going to be integrated into the buildings, into the architecture? How are they going to change the way architects design so that those physical spaces can contain interfaces? This is very much related, in my opinion, to a concept that Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi were exploring already in the 70s, and that we also have exhibited in this exhibition, the concept of architecture as a representation that emits light and information from its surfaces. You see here, this is not augmented reality, but Uber thinks about advertising in a different way than traditional advertising does. This is trying to be an interface. It's trying to be something like a notification on your phone, but it's in an airport. Now it works on airports because airports are kind of the same all over the world. So we can do that with airports today, and that's probably why standardized buildings are going to be some of the first buildings that we see augmented reality experiences appearing in. But when we try to apply this to any kind of building, it becomes much more complicated and much more dependent on the person's journey and their own sharing of data. So an exploration of how this could look like inside a house is, well, maybe we're going to have furniture that has notifications in it, and that tells you you've been sitting on myself, the chair. I am a chair, and you've been sitting on me too long, or you have nothing in the fridge, or why don't you upgrade your sofa? Or if we're capturing all that spatial data all the time, it can tell me that there's a mouse underneath the table and I haven't seen it. But what's important in this scene, though, is the gradient of realities. So we're going to be seeing people moving from a reality that is entirely physical to one that is entirely virtual, and everything in between. And it's going to be very smooth. Those transitions, we're barely going to notice. Another moment is augmented advertising. So when we think about ads today on the internet, we sometimes associate that with the idea of pop-ups kind of appearing as I'm trying to wade through and this is a direct translation of that. So I'm trying to live in my house and I have these balloons kind of hovering over me and I have to get rid of them. Now, augmented advertising is not going to be that. It's going to be subtle, it's going to be useful. But I wanted to bring attention to what we want it to be. What happens when physical space can be monetized through advertising? What happens if this appears in a public space? And so if I don't want to have a premium experience and pay for a premium experience, then my experience of the city is going to be subpar to that of another person who is not paying to have a premium experience of the city. What does that mean for public space? Is that space public still, even if it's not the same for everybody? What happens if we have buildings that are subsidized through advertising? What happens if there is social housing that is built cheaper because there is augmented advertising inside of it all the time? And that leads me to this idea, very famous quote, medium is the message. But I think it's so central to, at least it's something I repeat to myself every day in my work. Because you see, just like I was saying, what happens if these ads turn architecture into something different than it is today? Or what happens if the fact that this Nazi was being broadcasted turns the courtroom into something different? With AR, we are now laying the foundations to an entire new medium and platform and way of seeing the world, right? And so everything we're introducing is essentially going to change some of the aspects of how we relate to space, how we build space, how we relate to one another, and the things that we see with our eyes and our own perception of reality. So in a very coarse translation, if I optimize a room for wearing a VR headset and playing in VR, it looks like this. It's very sad, right? So there are things, details, where you can see the sensors, etc. You can also see this nice carpet over here. You can see how the carpet is a little bit separated from the wall. This is so that the guy doesn't crash against the wall because he can't see the wall. So he feels it with his feet. And so the common understanding that people have, that I have right now, that there's a wall here so I can't go through, now is transferred to the floor and to a material on the feet. And this happens just like in a snap. We don't even think about that. And that's just one thing, right? But who makes these decisions? Where are the architects who are taking care of these decisions? And the definition of space, is space now going to be defined through carpets? Like, do we want that? And then the last moment, and this is going to be just the end, is the virtuality reality continuum. So this is sounds kind of scary, but it just means a bit of theory introduced in the 1990s when augmented reality was being basically invented. Was first introduced by Boeing, the planes company, the term augmented reality. And so this is a theory that says that basically there is a continuum between the physical perception of reality and any kind of display that overlays information on top. So all the way to virtual reality, where everything is an overlay, down to just seeing through your normal eyes, and augmented reality is somewhere in between. And so I introduced that in the cloud housing exhibition through this scene in which the living room is transformed into something else that has been created by the user. And it has all kinds of things floating around. Like, for example, there's a chair that you can maybe download, and here are your books, which are situated next to your chair so that you can read and access the books when you're near the chair. And also the ceiling has disappeared and is now much higher, and it's actually a sky. And all that happens with this slider of reality. So we're going from personal reality all the way down to physical reality, and something I call balance in the middle as a way of just make a little provocation of what balanced should mean. So we already experience this in our daily lives. Like if I put on my headphones and I listen to whatever I want in the bus, then I don't want to pay attention to the rest. Then I take that off and I get off the bus and I'm paying attention again. And so it's a very natural continuum that we're already writing today. But it also, for me, raises questions about people's construction of their own bubbles. We know a lot about how people sometimes prefer to receive news that they already agree with. Many people get their news from social media. And there's a movement in creating, in people creating environments of information that are personalized to themselves and perhaps different to those of other people, which in turn may create social changes or social effects that are unclear, but still are there. When we take that out of the rectangles we see in a phone and we put that over people's eyes, then it becomes an entirely different question when you have different people experiencing and seeing space and the built environment in completely different ways and constructing it for themselves. So just to recap, these are the 3 moments: spatial data, augmented advertising, and the personal reality dials. And I'll just finish with this quote that both fascinates me and haunts me in my daily life, that we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. And with that, I'll finish and I'll open for questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, it was a very interesting lecture that raises a lot of questions, I believe. It's more answer some of the questions there I wanted to ask. So it's a very interesting. And the last sentence somehow that this kind of work somehow opens. It's very fascinating on one side, but also somehow frightening some of the implications somehow that it announces in the future. But maybe there's already someone that wants to ask questions before I. Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting, really fascinating subject. And I had like a question when you were speaking about the augmented advertising, and I was thinking maybe since the social media and most of the internet tools we have today as a social platform, etc., are becoming some kind of means of expression as well for like people that are users. So I was really thinking about new languages that are born like memes and stuff like that. And how is there a way that spatially it could be incorporated in virtual reality, like those social expression space exist or something like that?
Sure. So I have to recap your question for the sake of people who are on Zoom and who couldn't hear you. And let me know if I do it correctly. You're asking me whether some of the things that we see appearing on social media today, such as memes, could have an equivalent in virtual space or in augmented reality. Yeah. The answer is absolutely yes. And we are seeing that today. We have the entire world of face filters, which is augmented reality. That serves as a way of making memes and a way for people to express themselves and to share with each other their emotions, how they feel, and to relate to one another. I think that virtual space is not just space without people, it's also space with people in it and their embodiment. So some of the definitions of the metaverse really dwell on how it is a construction in which people have a continuous presence through an avatar. And so both the construction of that avatar and your own personality through an avatar for the metaverse and how you express yourself inside of it, as well as things that are happening today, like face filters. Yes, it's it's a new public space also, where people will just be able to communicate with one another through new ways, new bodies, new ways of understanding the face, the expression, and how you can move and what you take with you when you go from one place to another. Yes, there's another question.
Hello, thank you for the lecture.
Hello.
You were talking about people's construction of their own bubble, like the way it's happening. And you were talking about the way we choose things we want to receive or search the internet, etc. I mean, for me, it's kind of a result of or a consequence of the monetization and optimization of the data we give online. So the reason my feed is different than yours is probably mostly because of the things that I'm looking at already. So it's also a way of optimizing the clicks that I'm going to do, because the algorithms kind of know already what I want.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it seems to be optimization in terms of what the money the internet can get out of me through the data that I give. So, and also a way to control my opinions and the things that I'm seeing. So I wonder how you think it is possible that this can be different in a way, because we're reading a lot of things about the fact that technology is moving way faster than we can cope with. So in a way, it is completely influencing us in an unconscious way. So I wonder if you think that there is a way that this would not happen somehow, or this. It seems to me that this is kind of an unresolvable problem that monetization and optimization will always prevail and somehow become a mean of control of our reality.
Yes, I understand. I'm going to rephrase as well. So you're telling me that that in fact we are seeing those bubbles of information that people create around themselves, and that you think that this is very much rooted in monetization and the personalization of people's feeds and interfaces and products through the algorithms that create this, and whether it would be possible to avoid that entirely in the creation of Metaverse or augmented reality systems, right? I think that this existed. I think this is intrinsic to human beings. Like, if you ask most people who they think the most intelligent people are, they will usually name somebody that agrees with them. And before we had social media, you also had different newspapers, and people would pick the newspaper that they thought informed them the best, which is usually the newspaper that they would agree with the most. And then there is the issue of people having a critical sense of themselves in the world and their own limited understanding of reality, and wanting to contest their own opinions and wanting to explore other things. So these information bubbles are not just created in a feed, they are also created by the fact that you may want to visit the New York Times website every day instead of Breitbart. And so I think it is a more widespread phenomenon than just something based on monetization. But of course, monetization has played a big part and role in that, in knowing that the more you agree with something, the more you already want something, then the more likely it is that you're going to be interested. I think that it is not possible to eliminate this completely from physical space. In the end, people do prefer some spaces to others. They decorate their own spaces. They make them different. You, as an architect, there's always this tension, right? Even in the history of architecture, between the determination of an architect to dominate what a space that he or she designed, what it was supposed to be like, and then what people come and make out of it, right? Like they go and hang curtains on the Farnsworth house, and what a crime. And so it has deeper roots. I think that it is, however, very important to think about it because it's so much more dangerous. Because as I was saying before, when you have everything in a rectangle, it's so much easier to say, well, I read this on the New York Times and or I read this on Breitbart, or I saw this on my Facebook feed. But if you saw it in reality with your eyes, then that's an entirely different level of processing from your brain, right? You may not be aware that the person next to you is seeing something different. And we trust our eyes very much, more than it's a very natural thing. It's a sense. We think it's real. So I think that the answer to that question lies very much on what I was explaining before of separating geometry and physics. Like if we make augmented reality so realistic that people actually believe it's real, then we're getting into much more trouble with a question like this. So that's a place in which I would want the knife to go away from physics and more into just geometry. While there may be other places in which I want augmented reality to be more rooted in reality, so that there is still a connection with the real world and people just don't lose sense of what they're seeing. I think it's a very fundamental question. There is not an answer, but I don't think it can be completely avoided. I think that there is great responsibility in designing systems for that today. Yes.
You have also a question on chat. It's just maybe yeah, this was already.
Yeah, my question is more about the thanks for this amazing talk. The question is more about the influence of AR on the physical world than the opposite. It's because at this design I can see what we can do with AR in the world. We can remove screens and every surface can become a screen. I can display my NFT collections on my living room, things like that. But it will shape the tool of reality, as you mentioned. And do you have an idea of where the design of architecture and physical things, objects, is going in the augmented reality world, where we can use any object as an interface? Should we move? Are we moving it toward a flat rectangle and plain volume, white volume shaped world, or something completely different?
That's a question that fascinates me. I don't know. And I don't think we know yet. Yes, so on the one hand, you would think, well, let's make everything a surface like this, where we project media. But then I see many people operating in this space, like Space Popular in London, for example, they're a very interesting architecture studio that does work related to augmented reality as well, where they're going the total opposite. They're making spaces that are so rich in information themselves that when you augment them, that only then that information makes sense. So if you look at some of the things that we have displayed in this exhibition, you see that the display of information on facades in an architecture does not always equate just making a white rectangle and then putting things on it. Sometimes it's about the imbrication of that information with the elements of design and the elements of composition. I wish I would know. I hope it's not like that VR room with the carpet. But it just can go anywhere. And I think that's also why it's so interesting that it is part of my mission is to try and entice architects into this field so that they can have a voice in this that is not reactive, but active. Once all these things are done and decided, then the voice becomes more reactive. But today it is very active. Like there is not an answer to that. So you can go and give an answer to that. Like you can make a proposal. And that's the exciting thing about this field today. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that. I have a follow-up question to that, which was the idea of laying the foundation for the future with AR.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, if we look at our tools of representation and architecture, the big players are probably Autodesk and Adobe. But in the stream of corporations, they don't pale in comparison to Facebook and Apple. And so when we think about the tools and the ground foundation, I'm wondering, who do you think is laying that foundation? And it seems to me that we have this duality where we have a history of working in representational techniques that no one else understands. You can't explain to your parents.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have the opportunity to work with a representational technique that is global and everyone can come to terms with. But it seems like the trade-off is that it's run by the biggest corporations the world has seen. And I'm just wondering, like, how do you get a voice in that so that we're not, I guess my question would be, are we already trailing behind and playing catch up, or have those decisions already been made? And how do we reverse that?
I think that there is a very central question today, which is a question in this field, very technically, the question of interoperability. So interoperability means that the different companies or different platforms that are being developed for AR/VR should have a connection between one another. So that, for example, if you create an avatar with one service, and then you can take that avatar into the worlds of another service, or that if you're in this, and that's the concept of the metaverse, that is this space that you can transact in, you can represent yourself in, and you can jump from platform to platform. So I think, and interoperability, it's not too late to jump into that. Like, I don't think that it's set in stone how that would work. I also hear many voices in the industry for making things open source so that metaverse pieces can be extended by anybody so that it's all part of one platform. The idea of the metaverse or a 3D internet is more like the idea of the internet where anybody can have a website, and then there is, you know, the question of competition of who gets the most attention in it. But I don't, yes, like it's a thing that's on the table at the moment. There is also the question of standardization. I'm also on the board for the British Standardization Institute and the ISO rules. And it's a difficult effort. It's a difficult effort to create standards for things that several companies are creating at the same time and competing for. But one thing you raised that I think is very interesting is that, yes, in a way, 3D world tools enable a much larger set of people to represent and to design space in the way that in the past was only available to architects or people who could draw and knew the diedric system of representation and so on. And so that's a very interesting opportunity because I think we're also going to see much more user-generated architecture. I think this is going to be a new concept of how are people changing their houses digitally? How are they altering them? What happens if we start detecting that everybody wants higher ceilings? I don't know. That's a little, probably everybody wants higher ceilings. I don't know. But anything that we may not know right now and that will surface from this manipulation of space by users.
Maybe we can,
You can read the question on the chat.
From the chat.
Do I need you?
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Do you think the access of the metaverse will all be free or some portion could be restricted? I think there, just like on the internet, just like on a platform, there are going to be services that are restricted. Now, which essential parts are, whether essential parts of it are restricted or not, I think that's the question that we should be concerned about. But yes, if I want an avatar with cooler stuff, maybe I have to pay for it. And I think it's also interesting to think about models of monetization for the metaverse. They're not just advertising, which advertising makes everything free at a cost, right? But what if you subscribe to people and you pay them for being creators in the metaverse, so that you can access their pieces and their parts. And so it's a job for them. Or what happens if instead of subscribing to people, you just do buy virtual pieces the way you would buy NFTs today, which, you know, NFTs are partially paving the way for that kind of transaction in the metaverse. And that's one reason why they are important. Just like in the times of the creation of first civilizations and in Mesopotamia, there was a moment when there was a necessity to create a system to own land. And one of the reasons why written language was developed was in order to put land ownership on a register, on paper, on clay, actually. And so with NFTs, we're seeing something a little bit similar. We have this metaverse that maybe everybody can contribute to, maybe everybody can own pieces of, maybe everybody can access, but then how do different people own it? How do we pay for certain parts of it? Who exploits the different parts? It's also a technology that is being developed today or thought about, and that may be as important or as fundamental as written language was many thousands of years ago. This is perhaps too intrepid a theory, but
That's the second question about the workspace evolution.
how do you see the workspace's evolution along with the living space in the metaverse? I think they go hand in hand. Of course, we have seen a great explosion in virtual working with COVID. And so that has helped many people's imagination to just imagine it as something that would be much closer in time, that we could all work in a simulated environment together with other people. So if people do it on Zoom today, then why not do it in a 3D space? And I think that the workplace is going to be the first physical space and interaction space is affected by VR and AR. It's much easier, it's much more controlled. It has common characteristics across many companies, like a meeting room is a meeting room, right? And I think that the things I was presenting about living spaces will come later. But to me, they're more transformative because office spaces are already spaces that are highly mediated by technology and by control. Like there are already very defined systems of how to operate them, how to monetize office space, how to make it attractive for developers and so on. So I'm less interested in yes, sorry, question.
I've recently tried Facebook workrooms, and I was wondering if you already start using VR to work or collaborate, and if so, where do you see it going in 10 years, at least for yourself?
There are many people collaborating already in VR with that set of tools, and the way I see it evolving in 10 years is just moving it away from VR and into that spectrum that we were talking about of realities, in which I think in 10 years we'll probably have augmented reality glasses that are not just VR, but actual AR devices. And I think the form factor will certainly change. And I'm not sure if we're going to see everybody wanting to work in that type of environment. There is a lot that comes through human interaction that I think is very valuable.
One question among the trillions of questions. So I'm going to try to formulate it in a way that makes sense. And I want to start first to say that I'm not a hardcore AR or VR user, so I'm using IKEA app from time to time, things like that.
Okay.
And why I don't go there, and so much this way, I have a kid, he's 10 years old now. And I think 6 years back, I have a cardboard VR headset where you can put an Android device there. And actually I gave him the chance to try it out with a game that was about a place that you could walk into and look at. And at some point there is a bloody dinosaurs that come, and he got scared of that, and he had such a primal fear. I've never seen him like that. So it was like maybe 4 years old. and he was like so scared of the experience he was having, like take that thing off me and stuff. I've never seen him like that. So I'm very reluctant to go into a space where kids would be frightened by that as much as he was. And my question is how much do you think regulation would be required for a company like Facebook to actually design, work, deliver, and sell a product which might bring so much fear into society? So how can this be regulated in a way that we don't let that go until we fix all the other issues that we have with Facebook and the guys?
Yeah, well, regulation is very much called for from the tech world and very much needed. Things like regulating privacy rules, standardizing them across the different companies. Those are things that political constituents are much better equipped to do than private companies that would create standards that are different for different companies. So things like special events like elections or user privacy are things that really need to be regulated. I think it is harder to call for regulation of something that has not yet been created. That is something that I see in my work in the standards realm, where how do you, like, it is very difficult. Like, how, if you don't know what's going to happen, then what do you regulate? We have started standardizing things like safety. So related to what you're saying, things like how long you can have a headset on, how, you know, physical implications of having a headset on for a long time. So health and safety concerns, of course, fear is more complicated. Regulation is needed. I think that regulation is difficult. I think that if I had studied law instead of architecture, I would probably be giving this talk to lawyers and telling them, please get interested in this field, because we need lawyers that and politicians that understand these things very deeply in order to be able to affect them. Yes.
I have a question about the augmented reality and how it puts the function of a building or a specific part of the city in crisis. As for example, with VR, you can control everything, but with augmented reality, it has the basis on an existing place. And for example, I remember I think it was in 2016, where there was the whole Pokemon Go thing, that the city was in crisis because of some places that were not considered places for joining together and having activities that were now very popular because of this type of Pokemon of that. So now I see it as the same way as urban culture, as like skateboard and graffitis and everything. And we saw that this type of culture is kind of condemned by the city and by, I would say, like government, and architecture cannot really help or go against it. So now that we have this second coming of second layer of reality with architecture, do you see in any way that architecture can be friendly or against this type of new culture?
That's a great point. In fact, augmented reality through Pokemon Go and other things, also through tagging things or the Instagrammable spaces, it has changed the city because it creates hotspots of content. So cities by themselves have meaning and have content and have some places that are nodes that have more meaning, more content than others, that have more shops, that have more people, that have more visitors, that have more monuments. Now, when you overlay media on top of that, and you anchor some of that content that exists in this media to physical spaces, then you create different hotspots and different nodes and different connections between them. And you're asking me whether I think that architecture can affect that or take a position that is not just passive in well, I'm building and hopefully some Pokemons will come to me, right? Whether architects will be asked to respond to that, the answer is yes, obviously, of course. Perhaps in a bad way. So so you know, in the design of hotels today, people will There are people who think that it is important in every hotel built today to have an Instagrammable moment or several Instagrammable moments. So the fact that you create architecture so that it can be a hotspot in through media is already a reality today. But I don't see architects being very excited about creating Instagrammable moments, right? In fact, it elicits a critical response. And this is the role of architecture, to just sort of replicate something as vain as, or perhaps, I don't know. I think that there are implications with AR, VR that are more profound of how friendly is this space to AR, VR in the sense of how well tracked it can be because of its geometry. So there are geometry implications that some buildings, some facades, some things have less polygons and therefore it can be better tracked. And we get back to the question of whether a white cube is better for AR than something else. But it is also a very political question because you can now make political plans and decisions or urban planning decisions based on localizing hotspots in virtual space or in media without doing a massive intervention in the physical space, right? So if Pokemon Go had been controlled by a government, then they could say, well, we're going to revitalize this area by placing some Pokemons here and everybody is going to go. And then some cafes are going to open and therefore we're going to create a gentrification movement in this particular neighborhood through this introduction of Pokemons. When that goes into private hands as well, you have a very powerful tool for speculation, because you can anticipate that something is going to become a hotspot, and therefore the price of that land should be higher, even though there's no connection to anything physical that would make that land have a higher price. So I think, yes, I think architecture can play a role in making itself friendly or unfriendly to these, to the content, to virtual content. But I think it would be naive to not take into account actors such as politics, such as economic interests into consideration when designing those spaces. If we think as architects that it's only going to be geometry what determines this, then we're going to fall short of actually influencing virtual space and its manifestations in the city. Yes.
I mean, we're living in a context that it's in complete crisis, like especially with global warming and all the urgencies that are happening in our reality every day. And we know also like the impact of technology and servers and cryptocurrencies on our energy consumption. So yeah, I'm wondering how do you situate the work on this kind of technology in this context?
That's an excellent question. A very difficult one. Also one that falls outside of my area of expertise, if I can be honest. On the one hand, there are big efforts being made to optimize processes, to optimize energy consumption and things like artificial intelligence, which includes computer vision. On the other hand, yes, the creation of a virtual space or the advance of technology into ever increasing forms that demand more and more computing power, just simply, as a matter of fact, I think ecologically creates a need for more energy. Whether the industries are going to be able to maintain that energy consumption stable or not, I can't say. I don't know. I know that there are efforts being made. I know that it is in the interest of technological developers and companies to consume less by doing ever more complicated stuff. But I think it's also very much at the root of how we want to be designing for these spaces. How important, like how much value would a proliferation of data, of virtual objects create for the world, and whether it makes sense to have spent that amount of effort versus results that are going to bring better things to humanity. So that's why I think that the efforts need to be very directed, and that the metaverse shouldn't be a thing that just gets slapped onto the world and sorts itself out. I think it needs a lot of previous thought and effort by people across many disciplines, including architecture, but also including things related to energy consumption. Yes.
When you were talking about the augmented advertising, you casually mentioned the implementation of and designing of the augmented homes through the specific targeting of people that have not enough money to access housing. And for example, through I don't know, you mentioned like you have to watch this ad, for example, for I don't know, have in order to have a hot water, for example. And I wonder what is your stance on that, really?
Oh, that's a very dystopian thought.
Yes.
It's a provocation. Of course, with this exhibition, one of the things that I wanted to do was bring to the surface those dystopian possibilities, so that, yeah, it's just taking a critical position. I think that, of course, yes. I really do not hope to see social housing built on the premise of advertising and having to watch ads so that you can get hot water. I hope that that doesn't happen, but it is something that the technology enables. And you see, as the technology sector becomes less naive about its own influence in the world, so people like me who are creating augmented reality tools need to start to understand that things are not always used in the way we intend them to. Sometimes things will be used in any possible use that people can give it according to interests. And that is very hard to predict. And sometimes good intentions are not enough. Like there's a saying that I like that says, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. And so we need, as practitioners, to move beyond good intentions and examine the breadth of possibilities for doing damage with the tools that we create. That is one way of doing damage that I wanted to bring to the surface.
Well, thanks a lot. You did the moderation work go all along, so that's I'm impressed. Maybe I don't know. I have one last question, unless there are other ones. Yeah, there are more. Okay.
So how do you think? Because I guess somehow we are quite some geeks in the room, and some of us were there when Apple released the iPhone, and we might have thought that was right on time, the right thing that was needed. Not everybody understood it. It was like this thing that needs to happen to make computer and accessibility the right thing for people. How do you think, if I just use Apple as an example, an organization like that can test something like a metaverse? And as you said, try to understand the potential replication or the potential effects, or what would people like or dislike with using a wearable device that suddenly unleash anything that you could think about. How do you test this at scale? So you understand?
I think Apple would love to know the answer to that. It's of course, so in product design or in tech companies in general, in the processes, there is an emphasis that I see lacking in architecture, in general, which is the concept of user testing. So there, and the usage of data and tracking in order to understand whether the things that were released are working and people are liking them or not. So in architecture, we have things like post-occupational studies, but they're very underdeveloped in a general sense in comparison to how it's done in tech. So I think I can safely say that in the world of tech today, very few things are released that don't have some sort of following in terms of how people are using it. So user testing, whether qualitative, so interviews with people, or quantitative with tracking whether things are working, whether people are understanding the interfaces and so on. I think that's the main tool that exists today to test these things. But I think that there is also an element with the metaverse in particular of scale. Like when you release something like this at scale, then it is hard from just having tested with a few groups what that scale is going to do. And I think this is also outside of my level of expertise, but there are mathematical models that try to predict how things scale, and it becomes more and more unpredictable the bigger the data sets you have. Don't quote me on that. But I think that one thing that I value in architecture is the notion of the architect as an expert. So I think that technological products shouldn't only be designed and valued because they worked well with users today. And in architecture, you have this concept of the architect as a person who knows very well or who knows better, sometimes even better than the users, and that is questionable. But there is this notion of the architect as a designer whose intuition and whose knowledge has a lot of value. Whether in tech, it kind of is on the other side of the spectrum where, we put things out in the world and see what sticks sometimes. And I wish, that the two disciplines could get a little bit more together. So architecture would understand a little bit what happens with the spaces we release to the public after we release them. And also so that tech companies would value the expertise of designers so that people who can bring expertise and knowledge from history, from the humanities, from philosophy, from concept, from ideas, can put that into the things they design and into those foundations. And it's not only about what works. You ask very good questions. I'm very impressed.
We can continue with having a drink together also. Sure.
Yes.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Lucia. It was
Thank you, Pascal.
very impressive presentation. The price time was also great. So yeah, feel free to ask more questions to Lucia. As long as she's
yes, please.
there.
Once I have a drink in my hand.
That would be easy. Thanks a lot.